She was only 32 when her husband walked out. No warning, no answers, just silence that left her shattered. For years, she carried the weight of his absence, rebuilding herself piece by piece, learning to stand taller than the whispers and the loneliness. Then, 13 years later, at 45, he came crawling back, older, desperate, begging for a second chance. But what he found wasn't the fragile woman he abandoned. It was someone transformed, someone he no longer recognized. What happens when the one who left discovers a person they broke no longer needs them? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The suitcase had been sitting in the corner for 3 days, half open, clothes spilling from his mouth like it was impatient for the decision he had already made. She had noticed, of course. How could she not? Every step past the bedroom door, every glance across the floor reminded her that something unspoken was taking shape. Yet she kept quiet, hoping that silence might hold him still, that the weight of what they had built together would press him back into place. That morning, the air inside their home felt colder than the late autumn outside. The smell of coffee lingered in the kitchen, untouched by him, while his footsteps moved from room to room with a purpose that had nothing to do with work. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice. He didn't shout or curse the way she had braced herself for. Instead, he moved with a chilling calmness, folding shirts with mechanical precision, stacking them neatly in the suitcase as if he were preparing for a business trip. His silence was worse than any argument. Each drawer he opened, each jacket he pulled from the closet, spoke louder than words. She stood by the window, hands gripping the frame, watching the street as though the world outside might interrupt this quiet unraveling. When she finally turned to him, the question escaped before she had time to think. "You're really doing this?" Her voice cracked, raw with disbelief. He paused only long enough to look at her, his expression not angry, not even guilty, just distant, as though the life they had shared for a decade was already fading from his memory. "I can't stay here anymore," he said. The words were simple, ordinary, but they cut deeper than any betrayal she had imagined. Her mind raced back to the years they had spent together. The first apartment with its leaking pipes, the late nights building careers side by side, the vacations planned on tight budgets, the endless little rituals that had once given her comfort. She thought of the promises spoken in vows, the plans they had made for children that never came, the arguments that were supposed to be temporary, never final. All of it seemed to vanish in the time it took him to zip that suitcase. She followed him from room to room, not begging, not screaming, just asking questions she knew he wouldn't answer. "When did you decide? Was it something I did? Is there someone else?" He didn't flinch. He didn't deny or confess. His silence was a verdict all its own. He paused in the hallway, staring at a framed photograph of their wedding day, the one where she had been laughing mid-smile, while he whispered something only she could hear. Without touching it, he turned away, leaving the memory behind like it was just another item too heavy to carry. When he finally pulled the suitcase closed and lifted it by the handle, she felt her chest cave in. The sound of the zipper, final and sharp, echoed through the small house like a judge's gavel. She thought of all the mornings she had watched him leave for work, each time expecting his return in the evening. This time, she knew the door closing would not be followed by footsteps back inside. He avoided her eyes as he moved toward the door, muttering words that felt rehearsed. "You'll be fine. You're stronger than you think." She wanted to laugh at the cruelty of that sentence. He had measured her strength for years, leaned on it when his own faltered, trusted it to hold their lives together. Now he used it as his excuse to walk away. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the door shut behind him. The lock clicked, final and small, yet it echoed through the walls like thunder. The house fell silent, heavy with absence. The suitcase had gone, but his shadow remained, lingering in every room. She sank into the nearest chair, her body trembling, her mind refusing to accept what just happened. She stared at the empty space where his shoes used to sit by the door, where his jacket had hung on the hook, and realized that she had been abandoned not in anger, not in chaos, but in the quietest, most deliberate way. That silence would haunt her more than any fight ever could. The hours after his departure blurred together like smeared paint on glass, moments that should have been clear instead collapsing into one another. She sat on the edge of the couch where he had once stretched out to read the paper, the television silent. The air still heavy with the faint cologne that clung to his jacket as he carried it away. She was 32, but in that instant she felt much older, worn, hollow, like something essential had been drained from her bones. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was quiet, seeping into her slowly, settling deep into her chest until every breath reminded her of what had been lost. The house mocked her with its familiar comforts. The wedding photo on the mantelpiece, once a proud emblem of their journey, now seemed like an artifact from another life. The kitchen counter still held the mug he had left behind that morning, a faint rim of coffee staining its edge, proof of a routine that had ended without warning. She walked through each room like a stranger, touching the objects they had chosen together. The couch they saved 3 months' salary to buy. The curtains she had convinced him would make the place feel like a home. The bookshelf with novels bearing both their names written on the inside covers. Every item had once been a piece of them. Now they felt like accusations, reminders of the years she had poured into a life that no longer existed. Her disbelief became its own kind of prison. She replayed the scene in her head. The steady way he packed, the calm tone in which he explained nothing, the way he closed the door as if leaving for an errand. How could a man who once promised her forever reduce their life together to a silent departure? Her mind scrambled for reasons, for explanations, but the silence he left behind was more brutal than any truth. He had robbed her not just of a partner, but of certainty itself. The phone rang in the evening. Friends checking in, her mother's worried voice asking if everything was all right. She lied, told him he was away on business, her voice brittle as glass. Admitting the truth felt unbearable. To say out loud that he had abandoned her would make it real in a way she wasn't ready to face. She hung up quickly and let the phone rest untouched for the rest of the night, unwilling to hear her life reflected back in concern of others. By midnight, she sat at the kitchen table with the lights dimmed, staring at the half-empty glass of wine she had poured hours before but never touched. Her fingers traced the rim absent-mindedly, her body exhausted yet unable to rest. The bed upstairs waited for her, but the thought of lying in it alone, of rolling over to an emptiness where his body had always been, was more than she could endure. She stayed downstairs, drifting in and out of shallow, restless doze, haunted by the echo of his absence. Morning came without relief. The sun forced its way through the blinds, bright and intrusive, illuminating a space that felt unfamiliar despite being her own. She looked at herself in the mirror, at the dark circles under her eyes, the pallor in her skin, and barely recognized a woman staring back. 32, she thought. 32 and already discarded, as if the best years of her life had been given away for nothing. She pressed her palms against the sink, willing herself not to cry again. But the tears came anyway, hot and unrelenting, until the sound of her sobbing filled the silence of the house. In those first days, betrayal was not just an emotional wound. It was a physical weight. Her chest felt constricted, her stomach clenched in knots that food could not ease. Even her hands trembled when she tried to hold a pen, the simplest actions interrupted by the gravity of what he had done. She wondered how long it would take before her body stopped betraying her, before she could move without feeling like she was collapsing from the inside out. She knew, deep down, that this was not the end of her story. But at 32, standing in ruins of the life she had built, she could not imagine any road forward. All she could see were the years behind her, the devotion she had given, and the man who had walked away as though none of it mattered. And in that moment, the only truth she could cling to was that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence came first. It was not the peaceful kind, the kind she had once cherished on slow Sunday mornings when the world outside felt distant, and she could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing beside her. This silence was heavy, suffocating, pressing against her chest as she walked from room to room. The house, once alive with conversation, laughter, and the dull comfort of shared routines, now felt cavernous. Every creak of the floorboards startled her. Every hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud. Each ordinary sound amplified by the absence of man who used to fill the spaces between them. The living room was the worst. The couch sat untouched, pillows arranged just as she left him the night before he walked away. She could still see the imprint where he had often sat with book in hand or stretched out to watch late-night television. Now it was only fabric and cushion, holding nothing but memory. She tried sitting there once, but the emptiness pressed against her until she rose quickly, unable to stay. The walls seemed to echo back fragments of his voice, phrases she could almost hear as she let herself drift too close to remembering. In the bedroom, the silence grew sharper. The space beside her on the bed remained cool and unclaimed, the indentation of his body already fading. She found herself reaching out in the middle of the night, her hands searching instinctively for warmth that was no longer there. The sheets smelled faintly of him still, a mix of soap and cologne, but even that was slipping away with each passing day. She resisted washing them, as though holding on to that scent might keep him tethered to her in some small way. But the longer she left them untouched, the more it reminded her of the fact that she was living in a mausoleum of their marriage, preserving fragments of something that no longer existed. Even the kitchen betrayed her. The mugs they had collected from trips sat lined on the shelf, each one a reminder of places they had gone together, plans they had made. She reached for one out of habit, only to set it back down with trembling fingers. Cooking became unbearable. The act of preparing a meal for one felt like a cruel reminder of her aloneness. Plates clattered too loudly. Spoons scraped against bowls with an edge that grated on her nerves. More often than not, she let food spoil in the fridge, eating little, drifting through the days without appetite. The hallways carried their own weight. Photographs lined the walls, smiling faces staring back at her with frozen joy, mocking her with a version of life she could no longer claim. She considered taking them down, but when she lifted a frame from its nail, the pale rectangle of untouched paint beneath it looked even worse. It was as though the house itself bore scars of his absence, shadows of where he had been, and she couldn't decide which was more painful. The reminders of him or the void left behind when those reminders were gone. Nights were the hardest. When darkness fell and the world outside her windows grew quiet, the silence thickened until it felt almost alive. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness until her own heartbeat seemed too loud. She began leaving lights on in different rooms, just to trick herself into feeling less alone. Sometimes she'd turn on the television and let it play to an empty room, not for entertainment, but for the comfort of human voices, even if they were strangers. Days blurred into one another. The calendar on the wall remained stuck on the month he had left, as though time itself had chosen not to move forward. Dusk gathered more quickly than she remembered, as though the house had slowed its own heartbeat in sympathy with hers. She cleaned in bursts, then abandoned it for weeks, the rhythm of ordinary life impossible to maintain when the air itself felt foreign. She realized, slowly, that absence is not nothing. It has weight, it has form. It moves through empty rooms like a shadow, presses down on shoulders, clings to the corners of the mind. His absence became the most present thing in her life, louder than any sound he had ever made. And as she stood in the middle of their home, the silence surrounding her, she understood that this was not just about a man leaving. It was about learning how to live in a world where the echoes of what once was were louder than anything the present could give her. She replayed his words until they no longer sounded like words at all, just broken fragments carried on the air, stripped of meaning. "I can't stay here anymore." That was what it said, voice steady, as if he were announcing a change of address or resigning from a job rather than ending the life they had built together. She sat with that sentence day after day, rolling it over in her mind, as though repetition might unlock some hidden explanation buried within its simplicity. What did he mean by here? Did he mean the house, the marriage, her? The ambiguity clung to her, cruel in its refusal to offer clarity. She thought back to the way he hadn't looked her in the eye. His hands were steady as he zipped the suitcase, but his gaze had wandered past her, fixed on corners of the room as though the decision wasn't about her at all. That distance tormented her more than if he had shouted, more than if he had confessed a betrayal. If he had raged, she could have understood anger. If he had admitted to someone else, she could have understood desire. But this vague, emotionless severing, this calm abandonment, left her trapped in an endless maze of questions with no exit. At night, she returned to their last conversation, picking apart every syllable like evidence in a trial. "You'll be fine. You're stronger than you think." She mouthed the word in the darkness, staring at the ceiling as if it might answer her. Was that pity? A warning? An attempt at kindness? Or the most cowardly excuse he could muster? If he had truly believed in her strength, why did he choose to test it by walking away? The questions multiplied until they invaded every part of her life. In the grocery store, she found herself wondering if he had grown tired of their routines, of the same shelves, the same meals, the same rhythm of life they had once built together. Passing couples on the street, she wondered if he had ever envied strangers, if he had looked at other women with a longing that used to belong to her. At work, she questioned whether long hours, missed dinners, or her exhaustion had somehow pushed him toward the door. Every glance backward became an accusation she aimed at herself, because in the absence of his answers, she could only fill the silence with her own blame. Sometimes she almost convinced herself that he would return just to clarify, to explain in detail what she had done wrong or what he had been searching for. But the days passed, the phone remained silent, and the door never opened. His absence became its own answer, though not one she could accept. She was left holding fragments of a story that no longer fit together, torn between the memories of love he once swore to her and the emptiness of the departure he never justified. Even in her dreams, he haunted her with half-formed explanations. She would hear his voice behind her, feel his presence in the room, only to wake to the same silence, her body aching with the weight of questions that had no end. The mind craves closure, but betrayal offered none. It offered only a wound left open, raw and unhealed, exposed to every memory that drifted back. She tried writing once, hoping the act of putting words on paper might bring clarity. On a blank page, she scribbled down his sentences, his expressions, every detail of that final morning. She circled words, drew arrows between them, tried to build meaning where none existed. The page ended in angry lines, ink pressed too hard into the paper, the effort collapsing into frustration. She tore it out, crumpled it, and threw it away, only to sit staring at the empty notebook, the absence of answers mocking her more than the clutter of guesses had. The human heart, she realized, can endure pain if it understands its cause. Grief at least comes with a reason, death, loss, endings we can name. But abandonment without explanation was a different kind of cruelty. It was like being left in a locked room with no windows, the world outside moving on while she remained stuck, forever circling questions that yielded nothing. And in the stillness of those early weeks, she wondered if perhaps the greatest betrayal was not his leaving, but his silence, the refusal to give her even the dignity of truth. The first week after he left, she noticed how the silence of her home began to creep into her friendships as well. At first, people reached out with sympathetic voices, offering dinners, a couch to sit on, or a night out to distract her. Their concern felt genuine, but underneath it she sensed hesitation, as if her pain might be contagious, something they feared brushing too close to. When couples invited her over, she saw in the way the husbands shifted uncomfortably, in the way the wives chose their words carefully. Divorce or abandonment, as she could not yet bring herself to say aloud, had split more than her marriage. It had begun to split her circle in ways she had never anticipated. There were friends who aligned themselves with him, quietly at first, then more openly. They said they didn't want to take sides, but she could tell by the way their invitations dwindled, by the way his name slipped into conversations with familiarity they no longer extended to her. Some of them worked with him, share hobbies, or had been closer to his easy charm than to her steady presence. She imagined him explaining his decision in the same calm tone he had used that morning, offering vague phrases that somehow painted him as misunderstood rather than cruel. And they believed him, or maybe they wanted to, because it was easier than sitting with the discomfort of what he had done. Then there were those who stayed. The friend who showed up with groceries, ignoring her protests, filling the fridge so she wouldn't survive on coffee and stale bread. The co-worker who slipped her handwritten notes during the day, small reminders that she was seen, even when she felt invisible. The neighbor who knocked on her door at odd hours with casseroles she didn't eat, but whose presence softened the edges of the loneliness. These people stood not because they understood what she was going through, but because they refused to let her disappear inside her pain. Their loyalty startled her, a reminder that even as her world collapsed, not everything was lost. But there were also those in between, the ones who drifted slowly until their absence became another echo of loss. Invitations stopped coming. Texts went unanswered, and her social calendar that had once been filled with dinners and outings turned into empty squares. She could not blame them entirely. She was different now. Quiet where she used to be lively, withdrawn in moments that once invited laughter. She knew she had become difficult to sit with, her grief radiating like a weight that pressed into every conversation. Still, the knowledge didn't soften the sting of realizing that people she once counted on had quietly chosen not to walk this part of the road with her. She began to catalog them in her mind, not by names but by gestures. Those who left without explanation, those who stayed without needing one, those who hovered in the gray, unsure of how much of her sorrow they could bear. Each choice drew invisible lines around her, redrawing the map of her life in ways she hadn't expected. The fracture wasn't just between her and the man who had walked away. It was spreading outward, reshaping her place in the world. One evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table, she scrolled through her phone, thumb hovering over old group photos, smiling faces at dinners, parties, weddings. She wondered who in those pictures still saw her as part of their lives, and who now thought of her only in passing, as a woman left behind. The thought tightened her chest, but it also hardened something inside her. For years, she had shaped herself to fit into those circles, adjusting her words, her energy, to keep the peace. Now she saw clearly. When a marriage shattered, so too did the illusion of belonging. What remained was raw but honest. The people who stood by her did so without condition, and that, she realized, was worth more than the number she lost. The shift was painful, but it also stripped her life down to its essentials. In the absence of those who had quietly chosen him or chosen comfort over her pain, she began to see who truly valued her not as part of a couple, not as his wife, but as herself. And though the loss of friendships cut deeply, the clarity it brought was sharper still. She could no longer pretend that everyone was loyal. The fracture had exposed truths that had long been buried. And though it left her lonelier, it also left her standing with a circle small enough to trust. The office became her shelter in the months after he left. The sterile glow of computer screens, the hum of the printer, the endless shuffle of papers. Things that once felt tedious suddenly offered her the rhythm she craved. There, no one looked at her with pity. No one whispered questions about why she had been left or what part she might have played in the collapse of her marriage. At work, she was not the abandoned wife. She was reliable, efficient, and competent. A woman whose worth could be measured in deadlines met and projects completed rather than the failure of promises made an altar years before. She began arriving earlier than anyone else, the first to switch on the lights in the gray cubicles. The silence of the empty office felt different from the silence at home. It was not heavy or suffocating. Here it was expectant, a blank canvas she could fill with motion and purpose. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard, her desk stacked with files that proved she was still necessary to someone. When the others trickled in with their coffee cups and casual chatter, she already had an hour's work behind her, her mind occupied by tasks too consuming to leave room for memories. Co-workers noticed a change. She was the one who volunteered for late assignments, who took on the projects others avoided. Her inbox filled with requests, her phone rang more often, and she answered every call with brisk professionalism. It was easier to lose herself in the demands of others than to sit alone with her own questions. There was a strange comfort in spreadsheets and reports, in the certainty that effort here produced results. A proposal completed was acknowledged, an error corrected was praised. The cause and effect simplicity of work felt like a language she could still understand when everything else had become incomprehensible. Her boss, usually distracted and distant, began to comment on her dedication. A raised eyebrow at her staying late turned into nods of approval, then into recognition in meetings. For the first time in years, her name circulated with respect, attached to phrases like dependable and valuable. It startled her at first. She had spent so long blending into background her own life, making herself smaller, so her marriage could carry the appearance of balance, that the spotlight of acknowledgement felt almost intrusive. But she leaned into it. If she could no longer be seen at home, she would at least be seen here. Still, there were moments when the mask slipped. In the bathroom, Locked in a stall, she let tears fall silently before blotting them away with tissue, fixing her face before stepping back out into the fluorescent light. At her desk, she sometimes stared too long to family photos of others, smiling children taped to monitors, husbands' faces tucked into frames, and felt the ache rise in her chest. She buried it with more work, turning back to her tasks with a determination that bordered on desperation. Her evenings stretched into night shifts, the cleaners passing by her desk with puzzled glances. She pretended not to notice, eyes fixed on the screen as though the world beyond the office had ceased to exist. In a way, it had. The house she returned to was still filled with his absence, the bed still cold, the room still echoing. She could not bear to be inside those walls for long. So she filled her days with numbers, with charts, with the comfort of productivity. Each hour spent here was an hour not spent in the company of memories. Work did not heal her, but it steadied her. It gave her the illusion of control, a scaffolding to lean on while the foundation of her personal life remained shattered. And though she knew deep down that burying herself in the office could not replace what she had lost, she clung to it all the same. It was the one place where she was not broken, where her value was unquestioned. And for a woman piecing herself together at 32, that was enough to keep her moving forward. The whispers began almost immediately, curling their way through the neighborhood like smoke that refused to clear. She heard them in a grocery store when two women leaned too close to each other in the produce aisle, their voices low but their eyes sliding toward her as she passed. She heard them in the church lobby, in the quick silence that fell when she walked into a room, in the sudden change of topic that made it clear she'd been the subject just moments before. Abandonment carried its own peculiar stain, one that clung to her no matter how carefully she tried to move through her days. It wasn't just that he had left. It was that everyone now knew he had left, and that knowledge turned into speculation that weighed heavier than the truth itself. Her extended family was no kinder. At gatherings, the sympathy came wrapped in judgment, disguised as concern. A cousin tilted her head and asked, "Did you see it coming?" As if her failure to predict his departure was evidence of blindness. An aunt squeezed her hand and whispered, "Marriage takes work," the implication sharp enough to draw blood. Even those who meant well laced their comfort with questions that made her shrink inside herself. Did he meet someone else? Were you two having problems? They asked as though they had the right to an explanation, as though the unraveling of her marriage were a puzzle they were entitled to solve. At home, the walls seemed to echo with the weight of their judgments. She would stand at the window at dusk, watching her neighbors stroll the sidewalks, couples walking side by side, and she could feel their glances drift toward her empty driveway. The sight of her alone on the porch with a book or bringing groceries in by herself seemed to spark a story in their minds. She imagined them filling in the blanks, assigning blame, deciding which version of her they believed. The victim too fragile to keep a man, or the wife too flawed to hold one. Either way, she lost. What stung most was a shift in tone. Married friends who once welcomed her into their homes now hesitated, their laughter stiffening when she entered the room. Invitations arrived less often, as though her presence might infect their stability with questions they weren't ready to face. She caught the way husbands glanced at her too quickly, and wives noticed the unspoken suggestion that a single woman was now a risk. She had lost not only a partner, but the invisible protection that came with being part of a pair. Without him, she was seen as incomplete, exposed, a cautionary tale. Loneliness deepened under this weight. The house was empty, but so too were the spaces where she had once felt a sense of belonging. She found herself declining the few invitations that did come, too weary to face the eyes that lingered on her, too tired of the way conversations bent awkwardly around her absence of a husband. It was easier to stay home, to let the whispers carry on without her, than to sit beneath them and pretend not to hear. Yet in quiet moments, she recognized something else growing alongside the shame. Each cruel glance, each judgment wrapped in pity, began to expose the fragility of the structures she had once trusted. The neighborhood smiles had always been shallow. The family's advice had always been laced with expectation. Their whispers revealed more about their fear than about her failure. They needed someone to carry the stigma, so they could reassure themselves that their own marriages were safe. She became that vessel, their proof that abandonment happened to others, not to them. Still, knowing this did not lighten the burden. At 32, she carried the double weight of loss and reputation, grief and suspicion. Her silence fed their stories, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of answers. If she was going to be a subject of whispers, then let it be without her voice shaping their narrative. She would keep what little dignity she had left by withholding explanations that would never satisfy them anyway. At night, lie awake in a bed that still held a faint outline of a man who had chosen to leave. She wondered how long it would take for the whispers to fade. Perhaps they never would. Perhaps she would always be the woman he left, her identity branded by his absence. The thought pierced her, but beneath it flickered the faintest spark of defiance. If the world insisted on defining her by his betrayal, then in time she would show them something else, something they could not whisper away. The office was colder than she expected, though the thermostat on the wall read 72. It wasn't the air itself that chilled her, but the atmosphere of the place, the way the sterile furniture and fluorescent lights seemed designed to strip emotion out of the room. The lawyer's table was wide and polished, its surface empty except for neat stacks of paper that looked far too thin to represent 12 years of a life. She sat on one side, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while her lawyer slid pages in front of her with quiet efficiency. Across from her, an empty chair waited, a silent reminder that he had chosen not to come. His absence, like everything else, was a decision made with calm detachment. Her pen hovered over the first page. The document was titled with words that seemed impersonal and final. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The phrase struck her as clinical, as if love could be dissolved like sugar in water, as if vows could vanish simply because ink declared it so. Her lawyer cleared his throat gently, pointing to the signature line. This one just acknowledges receipt, he explained, his voice practiced and careful, as though speaking to someone in fragile condition. She nodded, but couldn't bring herself to look at him. Her eyes traced the language of the agreement, terms that reduce her years of devotion into categories: property, liabilities, division of assets. The house they had once decorated together was now listed as marital real estate, its warmth stripped away by language that saw only value in numbers. Their joint savings account, the one they had built carefully over years of sacrifice and small indulgences, was now a line item to be divided down the middle. Furniture, cars, even a dog they had once raised together were subject to the cold neutrality of distribution. She signed where she was told, her hand moving as though detached from her body, the ink flowing across the page like blood from a wound she could no longer feel. Each page grew heavier. She remembered how, on their wedding day, they had signed another document, a marriage license, witnessed and celebrated, the beginning of what she believed was forever. Now this was its mirror image, another document witnessed, another set of signatures, but this time it marked an ending no one cheered for. Her lawyer explained clauses and conditions, but the words blurred together, meaningless against the pounding of her thoughts. All she could see was his handwriting, absent from the pages, his decision delivered not in person but through paper. When she reached the section that declared irreconcilable differences, she paused. The phrase was so vague, so lifeless, and yet was now the official reason their marriage no longer existed. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Differences, irreconcilable. Words that failed to capture the reality of waking up alone, of waiting for a door to open that never did, of being left with questions unanswered. She signed anyway, because the system demanded it, because without her consent, the process could drag on even longer. The final document lay before her, the decree that would end it all. She hesitated, her pen trembling between her fingers. Her lawyer gave her a sympathetic nod, but he could not understand what it meant to write her name here, to place it beneath the declaration that her marriage was finished. With one signature, she severed the last formal tie between them. She pressed the pen to the paper, her hand slow, the letters of her name curling into permanence. When it was done, she let the pen fall, the sound of it clattering against the table sharp and final. The lawyer gathered the pages neatly, sliding them into a folder. He spoke of next steps, of processing times, of court filings, but she barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the space across the table, where he should have been sitting. She imagined him there, imagined what his face might look like as he signed away their life. Would he have been calm as always, detached, or would he have flinched, even slightly, at the weight of what he was discarding? The emptiness of the chair gave her no answer. When she walked out of the office, the afternoon light felt too bright, too sharp against her skin. People passed by on the sidewalk, carrying groceries, talking on their phones, living lives untouched by her private undoing. She clutched the folder against her chest, not because it mattered now, but because it contained the proof that her marriage had been reduced to paper and ink. What had once been love was now an official record stored in a drawer, forgotten by all except her. Night became her longest enemy. When the sun sank and the sky outside her window dissolved into darkness, the hours stretched into something unbearable, an expanse of time that refused to move. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic or the creak of the house settling, and every sound seemed to mock her with a reminder that she was alone. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was shallow, broken, and filled with dreams that circled back to him. She would wake with his name on her lips, her heart racing, her body aching with the illusion that he was still there, only to find the other side of the bed untouched, cold, and permanently empty. The memories gnawed at her most savagely when the world was quiet. During the day, she could bury herself in work, in errands, in the constant movement that disguised her grief as productivity. But at night, there was nowhere to run. The dark peeled back the layers of distraction, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his absence. She would replay moments in her mind. The sound of his laughter in the kitchen, the way his hand once rested on hers while they drove, the casual routines that had seemed eternal. Each memory felt like a ghost that slipped under the door, curling around her body, impossible to shut out. She tried to fight it. She bought heavy curtains to block the moonlight that only seemed to remind her of their long walks together. She placed a television in her room, letting the low drone of late-night shows fill the silence, hoping the voices would drown out her thoughts. She left the lamp on, convincing herself that light might chase away the ache. None of it worked. The silence always crept back, louder than before, pressing down until she found herself counting the hours until dawn. Sometimes she wandered the house instead, moving through the rooms in bare feet, touching the furniture, tracing her fingers along the walls. The spaces looked different in the dark. The living room felt cavernous, the kitchen colder, the hallway longer than it had ever seemed. She avoided the photographs still hanging on the walls, turning her eyes away from the smiles frozen in time. Even the smallest things, his old mug at the back of the cabinet, the worn indentation the chair he favored, pulled her back to the life she had lost. She wondered if she was losing her mind, reliving a life that no longer existed, searching for him in corners where only dust remained. The years passed, and still the nights did not ease. Even when she grew stronger by day, even when she rebuilt fragments of herself in work and in solitude, night remained the place where her doubts thrived. She questioned everything, whether she had missed the signs, whether she had been too blind to see him slipping away, whether she had been enough. The darkness magnified those questions until they were unbearable, and she would lie awake, her pillow damp with tears, whispering arguments to a man who would never answer. There were moments when exhaustion forced her into brief surrender, and in those hours she would dream of him as if he had never left. In dreams, he returned casually, stepping through the door as though the years apart had never happened. She would wake from those illusions with her body trembling, grief rushing back in waves, so sharp it felt new again. The cruelest part was that even her subconscious clung to him, refusing to let go, keeping her tethered to someone who had long since walked away. Sleeplessness became a part of her identity, the lines beneath her eyes deepening, her skin pale from nights spent awake. Friends remarked on her tiredness, offering remedies, teas, and advice, not realizing that her battle wasn't with restlessness, but with the memories that refused to release her. What she wanted was not sleep, but peace, and peace never came. And so the years carried on, each night another test of endurance. Dawn always arrived eventually, pale light creeping through the curtains, reminding her that the world continued whether she rested or not. She would rise with the heaviness of another sleepless night pressing on her shoulders, forcing herself into the day, determined to keep going. But in the quiet of her heart, she knew the nights would always belong to him, to the echoes of a life she could not yet forget, to the emptiness that lingered where love had once kept her safe. It was her friend Clara who finally broke through the shell she had built around herself. Clara had been there from the beginning, one of the few who hadn't drifted away when the marriage collapsed, who hadn't chosen sides or filled silence with judgment. She had watched quietly as the years passed, offering dinners, phone calls, and company when it was wanted, never forcing more than she could give. But Clara saw what others didn't. The deep circles beneath her eyes, the exhaustion that clung to her body, the way her laughter had vanished and been replaced with a brittle smile that never reached her eyes. One evening, after another restless week that left her looking pale and thin, Clara decided it was time to speak plainly. They were sitting at the small cafe they used to visit in their 20s, back when life had felt wide open and unbreakable. Clara sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on her friend across the table. "You can't keep doing this," she said gently but firmly. "You're burning yourself out." The words made her shift uncomfortably, glancing away toward the window, as if watching strangers walk by could shield her from the truth. She muttered something about being fine, about work keeping her busy, but Clara shook her head. "Fine isn't what you look like. Fine isn't sleepless nights and crying in silence. You've carried this alone long enough." At first she resisted. The idea of counseling seemed like admitting defeat, as though seeking help would mean acknowledging she hadn't been strong enough to survive on her own. For years, she had clung to the notion that independence was proof of resilience, that rebuilding herself without leaning on anyone was the only way to reclaim dignity. But Clara's words echoed in her ears long after they left the cafe. That night, lying awake in bed as usual, she replayed the conversation. The image of Clara's steady gaze haunted her more than the memories of her husband. Clara hadn't been pitying. She had been resolute, insistent in her belief that healing didn't have to be solitary. The following week, Clara pressed again, sending her a list of names, therapists she had researched. "Just talk to one," she urged over the phone. "It's not weakness. It's giving yourself a chance." She held the slip of paper for days, folding and unfolding at her desk, staring at the phone without dialing. But the nights wore her down. Each sleepless hour made Clara's words feel less like suggestion and more like necessity. Finally, one afternoon, her hands trembling, she made the call. Walking into the therapist's office was not easy. The waiting room smelled faintly of lavender, the kind meant to soothe nerves, but only made her feel more aware of her own tension. She almost turned back before her name was called. Sitting in the chair, across from a stranger who simply asked, "What brings you here?" felt unbearable. Yet once she began to speak, haltingly, clumsily, the dam inside her cracked. She heard herself describe the night he left, the silence of the house, the whispers of neighbors, the weight of sleepless years. The words poured out, tangled and raw, and with them came tears she had held back for too long. Clara was right. She had carried it alone long enough, and though it felt strange, even frightening, to share her pain with someone trained to listen, she felt a shift begin inside her. It was a relief, not yet, but it was something, an opening, a possibility that maybe, after years of circling the same grief, there was another path forward. That night, when she called Clara to say thank you, her voice cracked but carried a note of sincerity that had been absent for years. Clara simply replied, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." The chair was softer than she expected, cushion enough to swallow her if she leaned back too far. She sat stiffly at first, hands knotted in her lap, as though her body didn't trust the comfort it was being offered. Across from her, the therapist waited with a patience that felt foreign. No rushed questions, no pitying glances, just space. It unnerved her more than it soothed. For years she lived in the noise of her own mind, where memories replayed like broken film reels, and now she was being asked to give those thoughts shape in words. At their first sessions, she spoke mostly of him. She described the day he left, the suitcase that had been waiting for weeks, the sentence that ended her marriage. "I can't stay here anymore," she said aloud as though it might mean something new, but each time it tasted just as hollow. The therapist nodded, asking her to linger on what those words had meant to her. She admitted she had spent years dissecting them, searching for a secret she could never uncover. "It wasn't just that he left," she whispered once. "It was that he left me without answers." But over time, the questions began to shift. The therapist asked not only about him, but about her. What had she needed in those years before he walked out? What parts of herself had she silenced to keep the marriage steady? At first, she bristled. She had spent so long framing herself as a victim that turning the light inward felt like betrayal of her own pain. Yet as the weeks passed, she began to realize how often she had chosen quiet over confrontation. She remembered dinners where she swallowed her disappointment, nights where she noticed his growing distance but convinced herself it was stress or fatigue, moments when she longed for tenderness but never asked. "I thought if I didn't make demands, he would stay," she confessed, tears filling her eyes. "I thought silence was safer than speaking." Those words lingered between them. Silence had been her shield, but it had also been her prison. In keeping herself small, in muting her needs, she had allowed her own voice to vanish. The therapist reminded her that his leaving was not her fault, that his betrayal was his choice alone, but also that healing required more than mourning what he had taken. It required her to see what she had given up willingly, the parts of herself she had neglected out of fear of losing him. Each session chipped away at the image she had held on to, that she had been blindsided, powerless, discarded. She began to understand that her story was more complicated. She had lived years in the shadows of compromise, trading pieces of her identity for the illusion of harmony. His leaving had shattered her, but had also forced her to see how long she had lived unseen, even by herself. The hardest moments came when she was asked what she wanted now. The question felt foreign. For so long, her life had been defined by what he wanted, by keeping the peace, by surviving his absence. She stumbled over the answers, fumbling with vague words, stability, calm, maybe joy. But week by week, the answers grew clearer. She wanted more than survival. She wanted to reclaim the voice she had silenced, to name her needs without apology. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy session, she sat in her car outside the office and let the realization sink in. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about what he had done. She was thinking about herself, about the shape of a life that could belong to her alone. The pain of betrayal still lived inside her, but it was no longer the only story. Slowly, painfully, she was beginning to tell a new one. It began quietly, so quietly that no one else would have noticed if they weren't looking closely. After years of living in muted tones, in clothes that were chosen for comfort or for his approval, she bought a dress that was nothing like what she used to wear. It was bold, a shade of red that seemed almost too loud when she first held it up in the mirror. She hesitated, nearly left it behind on the rack, but something in her urged her to take it home. The first time she wore it, just to run errands, she felt exposed, as though the world might laugh at her for daring to step outside of her old self. But when she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a shop window, she didn't see the abandoned wife anymore. She saw a woman reclaiming space. The rebellion spread from her wardrobe to her daily rhythms. She began waking earlier, not because work demanded it, but because she wanted quiet hours for herself. Instead of rushing to the office to bury herself in paperwork, she lingered over coffee, read books she had long abandoned, and let music fill the kitchen. Songs she hadn't listened to in years spilled from the speakers. Jazz, folk, even old pop tracks she once loved, but stopped playing because he had dismissed them as silly. Now the melodies became her companions, carrying her through mornings with a lightness she had almost forgotten existed. Food became another act of defiance. For years, she had cooked with his preferences in mind, adjusting recipes to suit his tastes. Now, she experimented with dishes she had always wanted to try, but never made. Spicy curries, rich stews, delicate pastries, flavors that belonged entirely to her. The kitchen, once a place of compromise, turned into a laboratory of discovery. She ate what she pleased, savoring meals alone at the table without apology. Her body, too, began to feel like her own again. She joined a yoga class at a small studio near her house, slipping off her shoes and stepping onto the mat with a mixture of nervousness and determination. At first, she wobbled to the poses, her body stiff, her mind racing. But with each class, she learned to breathe deeper, to stretch into movements that made her feel both grounded and free. The sweat on her skin and the ache in her muscles became proof of progress. Not for anyone else, not to prove her worth, but to remind herself that she was still alive, still capable of change. Even her home began to shift under the weight of these rebellions. She rearranged furniture, painted a wall in a shade of green that brightened the whole room, hung artwork she had chosen without compromise. Each change was small, but together they transformed the space from a museum of memories into a place that finally felt hers. She found herself lighting candles at night, not to mask emptiness, but to create warmth. She allowed laughter back into the rooms, sometimes alone, sometimes with a few friends who had remained by her side. These acts were not grand or dramatic, but they stitched her back together in ways the world couldn't see. For so long, she had lived as though she were waiting for permission to dress boldly, to enjoy her own company, to shape her days as she pleased. Now she discovered that the only permission she needed was her own. Every small rebellion was a declaration that she was no longer defined by what had been taken from her. She was building herself again, piece by piece, choice by choice. Late one evening, standing in front of the mirror in that red dress, she let her hand rest against a reflection. For the first time in years, she didn't see someone diminished by abandonment. She saw someone beginning again, not with certainty, but with courage. And though the world outside still whispered, though the nights were not always free of memory, inside herself she felt the first sparks of something unfamiliar yet precious: freedom. The house had always been theirs, or at least that was how it had felt in the early years. Every wall carried a compromise, every piece of furniture a decision negotiated between two people trying to fit their tastes into a shared life. After he left, the space became a mausoleum, filled with echoes of what had been. For months she had lived among those ghosts, too paralyzed to touch the photographs, too hollow to rearrange even a single chair. But as a quiet rebellion began to build within her, she realized the house no longer had to be a monument to absence. It could become something new, something that belonged to her alone. She started with the smallest corner, the entryway. For years, his jacket had hung on the hook, even after he was gone. The sight of that empty space mocked her each time she stepped inside. One afternoon, with the light streaming through the door, she pulled the hook from the wall and replaced it with a small shelf she built herself, rough and imperfect, painted a cheerful yellow. On it she placed a plant, its green leaves spilling over the edge, a living thing that welcomed her each time she came home. That single act shifted something deep inside her. The house no longer had to wait for him. It could grow with her. From there, she moved to the living room. The couch they had chosen together, practical and neutral, felt like it carried the weight of every silent evening they had endured before he left. She sold it without hesitation, surprising even herself with how quickly she let it go. In its place, she bought a second-hand sofa in a soft blue, a color he would have dismissed as frivolous. She piled it with cushions in mismatched patterns, each one chosen for the way it made her smile. When she sat there in the evenings, the room felt lighter, as though the air itself had shifted. The walls followed. She had lived for years with beige, safe, quiet, forgettable. Now she reached for colors she had never dared to suggest before. A warm terracotta in the dining room, a deep emerald in the bedroom. The brush in her hand became a weapon against the memories, each stroke of paint an act of defiance. With every wall she transformed, the past receded further, replaced by spaces that reflected her spirit rather than his restraint. The house became her canvas, and she reveled in the freedom to shape it without compromise. The kitchen, once a place of routine and compromise, became a workshop of her independence. She tore down the heavy curtains he had insisted on, letting sunlight flood the space. She hung copper pans against the wall, filled jars with spices that filled the air with scents he had never liked: cumin, turmeric, cinnamon. The counters no longer held his favorite coffee machine, which he had given away to a friend. Instead, they displayed bowls of fresh fruit, cookbooks stained with her experiments, reminders of meals made for herself, not for anyone else's approval. Even the bedroom changed. The bed they had shared was replaced, the mattress carried out with quiet determination. In its place, she chose one that felt like her own, draped with linen soft and colorful, not the muted tones he had preferred. She placed a chair by the window, a space for reading at night, and hung sheer curtains that moved with the breeze, catching the morning light. For the first time in years, the room did not feel like a place of loss. It felt like a sanctuary. As the renovations unfolded, so too did her sense of self. Friends who visited remarked on the transformation, surprised by the boldness of her choices, the warmth that now filled the rooms. But it wasn't for them, not really. It was for her, the woman who had once shrunk into silence, who had once lived in a house that echoed with absence. Now, every corner spoke her name. Every change declared that she was no longer living in the remnants of what he had left behind. She was building something wholly her own. One evening, when the work was done for the day, she stood in the center of the living room, paint still drying on the walls, her hands streaked with color. The house smelled of fresh beginnings, of wood shavings and lemon soap, of meals she had cooked while music played in the background. She realized she no longer saw the house as the place where he had left her. It was no longer theirs. It was hers, reclaimed, redefined, and alive again. The changes at home seemed to ripple outward, reaching even into halls of her workplace. For years, she had been the quiet one in the office, the dependable colleague who completed tasks on time, who stayed late when others left early, who carried more weight than most but never demanded recognition. Her marriage had trained her to live small, to avoid attention, to let others take the spotlight, while she worked steadily in the background. But now, without realizing it, she carried herself differently. The same woman who had painted her bedroom walls emerald green and cooked meals to please only herself began walking into the office with a quiet confidence that did not go unnoticed. Her boss was the first to remark on it. During a weekly meeting, as she presented a project update, her voice was steadier than before, her points sharper, her ideas no longer wrapped in hesitation. The room grew quiet as colleagues leaned forward, paying attention to words they might once have overlooked. When she finished, her boss nodded thoughtfully and said, "Excellent work. I'd like you to lead the next phase." The sentence was simple, but it cracked something open inside her. For years, she had done the work of a leader without the title. Now the title was finally beginning to catch up. Promotions followed, not overnight, but steadily. She was given more responsibility, larger teams to manage, and projects that reached beyond her department. With each new challenge, she felt herself expand into the role. The long nights she had once used to escape the emptiness of her house now bore fruit. Her diligence, once a shield against grief, had become the foundation of her reputation. Colleagues sought her advice, younger staff looked to her as a mentor, and in meetings her voice carried weight that was impossible to ignore. Recognition brought its own strange discomfort. Praise had always been something she brushed aside, fearful of drawing too much attention. But now, as colleagues congratulated her, she forced herself to accept it without deflection. She practiced saying thank you instead of minimizing her effort. The more she allowed herself to be seen, the more natural it became. Respect no longer felt like an accident. It felt earned. With each promotion came new opportunities to travel, to speak at conferences, to step onto stages where she once would have hidden in the back row. The first time she addressed a room of strangers, her hands trembled at the podium, but her voice held firm. When applause came, it startled her, not because she didn't think her words had value, but because she had spent so many years convinced they never would. That applause echoed in her long after, louder than any whisper of abandonment, louder than the silence of her sleepless nights. The financial rewards eased burdens she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Bills that once loomed now felt manageable. She renovated not only her home but her life, traveling when she wished, buying books and clothes without guilt, investing in herself in ways she had never dared before. Success gave her freedom, but also gave her proof that she was more than the woman left behind, more than the shadow of a failed marriage. She was someone others respected, someone whose presence mattered in rooms that had once overlooked her. Still, there were moments of reflection. Late at night, reviewing reports or preparing for meetings, she sometimes thought of him and wondered if he had ever imagined her like this. He had left her believing she would crumble, that her strength was not enough to keep him. And yet here she was, thriving in ways he would never witness. The thought did not bring bitterness so much as clarity. His absence had forced her to grow into spaces she might never have entered otherwise. The man who had once defined her worth by his approval was now irrelevant to the success she had built with her own hands. Standing in her office one evening, the city light spilling through the window, she looked at the plaque on her desk that bore her new title. It wasn't just a recognition of her work. It was a testament to survival, to reinvention, to the quiet power she had discovered in herself. For the first time in years, she felt not only respected but whole, no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had created. The first time she went back to her parents' house after the separation papers were finalized, she felt like she was carrying a secret in her chest that weighed more than her suitcase. For months, she had avoided long visits, keeping her phone calls short and filled with rehearsed lines about being busy with work. Her parents had asked questions, of course. They always did. But she had deflected, unwilling to give words to what she herself had barely begun to accept. Now, as she walked up the familiar porch steps, the paint peeling in the same places it had for years, she felt a kind of trembling inside. This was the place she had once returned to for comfort after childhood disappointments. Yet now she dreaded the vulnerability of being seen too clearly. Her mother opened the door, her face lined with worry and something softer, something that told her she already knew more than had been said. The embrace was long, her mother's arms holding her with a firmness that felt both grounding and unsteadying at once. Her father was quieter, offering a simple nod and a hand on her shoulder as though to say, "We'll take this at your pace." They did not press her immediately. Instead, they set the table, filled her plate with food, and waited until the silence between them grew thick enough that it begged to be broken. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He left." The words sounded blunt, almost childlike, and yet they released a flood she had held back for too long. She told him how it happened, how he had packed his bag with the calmness of someone preparing for a trip, how he had spoken no real explanations, only vague sentences that dissolved under scrutiny. She expected anger, perhaps outrage at his cruelty, but what she saw instead was sorrow. Sorrow for the years she had suffered in silence, sorrow for the daughter who had carried this weight alone. Her mother reached across the table, covering her hand, while her father sat with eyes lowered, his jaw tight in a way that revealed how hard he was working to contain his own emotions. Later, with her siblings, the conversations were different. Some of them were surprised by how much she had hidden. One brother admitted he had suspected trouble, but had assumed she would confide in him if it were serious. A sister asked why she hadn't reached out sooner, her tone carrying hurt more than judgment. She struggled to explain that shame had silenced her, that the fear of being pitted had been heavier than the burden of loneliness. To speak of it now was both painful and liberating, as though she were cutting threads that had bound her in secrecy. What surprised her most was how sharing her story shifted the atmosphere. Instead of pity, she found connection. Her siblings began to share struggles of their own, marital tensions, financial fears, the weight of parenthood. For years, she had been the one who listened, who offered support without revealing her own cracks. Now, in her vulnerability, she realized she was not alone in carrying disappointments. The honesty opened doors she hadn't known were closed, and in their company, she felt less like a failure and more like a sister among equals, human in her imperfections. With her parents, healing came more slowly but just as deeply. Her father took to calling her more often, not to ask questions but simply check in, his voice steady in its quiet affection. Her mother, once insistent on advice, grew gentler, understanding that what her daughter needed most was not instruction but presence. In their acceptance, she began to rebuild a sense of belonging that had felt shattered. One evening, sitting in her parents' living room with the sound of rain against the windows, she felt a calm she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of secrecy had lifted, replaced by the knowledge that her family saw her clearly and loved her still. She wasn't just a woman he had left. She was a daughter, a sister, a part of something that had endured despite everything. For the first time since the night of his departure, she allowed herself to rest without bracing against the silence. This time, the silence was gentle, filled not with absence, but with the steady presence of people who would not walk away. The first invitation arrived in a pale cream envelope, the kind that once brought excitement. It was from an old friend announcing her wedding, and as soon as she saw the handwriting, her stomach tightened. Weddings had always been a celebration she loved, a chance to dance, to drink wine, to toast a future still unfolding. But now the very idea of walking into a hall alone filled her with dread. She set the envelope aside for days, unable to open it, already rehearsing excuses. When she finally lifted the flap and read the card, the details blurred before her eyes. All she could see was a seat she would occupy by herself, the pitying glances from couples across the table, the whispered comments about how she was managing since he left. In the end, she declined. She wrote a polite note about scheduling conflicts, her hand steady but her heart aching. It was easier to miss the event entirely than to stand in a room filled with reminders of what had been taken from her. But the invitations kept coming. Birthdays, reunions, baby showers, milestones that once would have felt like anchors now loomed like tests she wasn't ready for. Each one carried the same silent question. Would she appear alone to prove she could endure the scrutiny? Or would she retreat again, allowing absence to define her? The first time she forced herself to go, it was her cousin's anniversary party. She walked into the restaurant, her dress carefully chosen, her hair neat, every detail designed to signal control. Yet the moment she entered, she felt the eyes. Couples held hands, children darted between tables, and she took her place at a corner chair, acutely aware of the empty space beside her. Some relatives leaned in with exaggerated warmth, offering extra smiles that stung more than indifference. Others avoided her entirely, as though her presence was an awkward reminder of how easily marriage could collapse. At first, she shrank under the weight of it. She kept her glass of water full, sipped slowly, and focused on her plate while conversation swirled around her. But as the evening went on, something shifted. A niece asked her to dance, tugging at her hand with innocent insistence. On the dance floor, laughter spilled out of her before she could stop it, genuine and unguarded. For those few moments, she forgot about the empty chair, the whispers, the pity. She remembered that joy did not belong exclusively to couples. That night became a turning point. She still declined many invitations, but not all. The one she chose to attend, she entered with a new determination. Yes, she came alone. Yes, the eyes noticed. But with each gathering, she discovered that the world did not end because she walked in without a partner. She learned to hold her head higher, to engage in conversations without apology, to laugh freely even when it startled those who expected her to remain fragile. At a high school reunion, an old classmate remarked, "I admire how strong you are." The word struck her as odd. She hadn't thought of strength when she decided to attend. She had only thought of living, of refusing to let absence dictate her choices. Yet as she stood there, surrounded by people who measured their lives in comparisons, she realized her presence was its own quiet declaration. She was no longer hiding. There were still moments of ache, catching sight of couples leaning into each other, watching rings glint in the light. But the ache no longer paralyzed her. It simply existed alongside her resilience, no longer the loudest part of her story. She began to understand that walking into a room alone was not a mark of failure. It was proof that she was still standing, still moving, still refusing to vanish into the shadows of what she had lost. One evening, leaving another gathering, she paused in the doorway, looking back at the laughter and chatter behind her. For the first time, she did not feel diminished. She felt tall, her solitude no longer a burden but a stance. She walked out into the night air with her shoulders straight, realizing that attending alone was not a weakness but a victory. She had survived the whispers, the pity, the awkward silences. More than that, she had learned to stand tall in her own name. It began almost without her noticing. At work, the younger staff who once saw her as just another senior employee started hovering near her desk more often. At first, they came with questions about projects or deadlines, the ordinary things that filled the rhythm of office life. But gradually, she sensed something else in their eyes, curiosity, even admiration. They watched the way she carried herself, the quiet steadiness in her voice during meetings, the way she never faltered under pressure. She had spent years believing her survival was invisible, a private battle fought in silence. Yet it seemed the world had been watching all along, quietly taking note of the woman who endured without collapsing. One afternoon, After a tense presentation that she had managed with her usual composure, a junior colleague lingered behind as the others filed out. "I don't know how you do it," the young woman said softly, almost shyly. "You never look rattled. Even when everything is falling apart, you stay calm." The word startled her. She wanted to laugh, to confess that she was often rattled. That night still left her sleepless. That calm was something she stitched together with sheer willpower. But she swallowed the protest and instead offered a small smile. "You just keep going," she said. "That's all you can do." That phrase seemed to ripple outward. More and more, younger colleagues came to her for advice, not just about work, but about life. They asked how she handled setbacks, how she kept her composure when things didn't go as planned. One young man confessed that he had gone through a breakup and couldn't focus, and he looked at her as though she might hand him the secret to surviving heartbreak. She didn't tell him the whole story. She rarely did, but she offered pieces of her truth. That pain doesn't disappear overnight. That strength doesn't mean the absence of hurt, but the choice to move forward in spite of it. At first, their admiration made her uncomfortable. She still thought of herself as the woman left behind, the one who had been discarded without explanation. Yet as she listened to the younger staff speak of her with respect, she began to realize they didn't see her through the lens of abandonment. They saw her as someone who had endured and kept her dignity intact. They didn't know the nights she cried into her pillow, the mornings she dragged herself out of bed with red eyes. What they saw was a result, a woman still standing, still contributing, still unbroken. It wasn't only in the office. Among friends and peers, too, she noticed subtle shifts. People who once spoke cautiously around her now turned to her for perspective. At social gatherings, she was no longer treated as fragile, but as someone with wisdom carved from hardship. A friend confided that she admired how she had rebuilt her life, how she had managed to redefine herself without bitterness. Hearing it said aloud felt strange, almost foreign, but it planted a seed of recognition. Perhaps she was no longer just surviving. Perhaps she was becoming someone others could look to, not out of pity, but out of respect. The admiration did not erase her loneliness, but it reframed it. Her solitude was no longer a symbol of loss, but of independence. The younger colleagues who watched her saw not a woman diminished, but a woman who had endured storms and walked out taller. In their eyes, she began to catch glimpses of herself that she had not yet claimed. The strength, the resilience, the quiet authority of someone who had faced despair and chosen not to bow to it. One evening, as she left the office late, a group of younger staff walked out with her. They asked about her weekend plans, their tone light but genuine, their presence warm. As they parted ways, one of them turned back and said, "You give us hope, you know, that no matter what happens, we can still build something solid." She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment after they left, the city lights glowing around her, letting the words sink in. For so long, she had carried the weight of being left, of being defined by what she had lost. Now she was beginning to see that her story was no longer about him at all. It was about the quiet power of survival, the way it could inspire others without her even trying. It happened slowly, without the drama she once imagined. There was no sudden revelation, no grand moment when she declared aloud that she was free of him. Instead, the turning point came one quiet morning as she stood in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window onto floors she had recently polished. She was stirring her coffee, absent-mindedly listening to the radio, when she realized she hadn't thought of him the night before. For years, he had haunted her evenings, appearing in dreams and memories, in the hollow ache of an empty bed. But last night, she had slept soundly. She had dreamed of nothing she could recall. And in that stillness of realization, her chest felt lighter, as though a weight she had carried unconsciously had begun to loosen its grip. At first, she resisted naming it. She told herself it was temporary, that he would return to her thoughts soon enough, that the old ache would reclaim its space. But as the days stretched into weeks, she noticed the pattern repeating. Work filled her mind. Plans with friends filled her weekends. Her own company felt less like a punishment and more like a choice. She could sit in her living room without hearing echoes of his laughter, cook dinner without imagining his empty chair across from her, and walk through the front door without bracing for a ghost that no longer came. She realized she had stopped waiting for his return. The hope that had once kept her chained to the past, the hope that maybe one day he would come back, explain himself, ask forgiveness, had faded into something else. It wasn't bitterness. Not anymore. It was acceptance. She did not need his answers to move forward. She did not need his presence to validate her worth. For so long, her life had been measured in relation to his absence. Now it was measured in relation to herself. There was a day when she came across an old shirt of his, buried at the back of the closet, something she had overlooked during her earlier purges. In the past, it would have undone her, sent her spiraling into tears or questions. This time, she simply held it in her hands, studied the fabric, and felt nothing more than a faint trace of history. She folded it neatly and placed it in a donation bag. When she carried the bag out of the house, there was no ceremony, no collapse, only the quiet assurance that it no longer had power over her. Friends noticed before she did. They remarked on the way her laughter returned more easily, the way she looked people in the eye, the way her energy seemed brighter. Younger colleagues who had once admired her resilience now saw her joy too, a spark that had been absent for so long. Even her family, who had walked beside her through the years of silence and sorrow, commented on how she seemed different. She didn't deny it. For the first time, she allowed their observations to settle without protest. What surprised her most was not the absence of pain, but the presence of possibility. She began thinking of the future in ways she hadn't dared before. Travel she wanted to take, courses she wanted to enroll in, even the prospect of love, not as something she needed, but as something she might one day welcome. The horizon no longer looked bleak. It looked wide, open, waiting. One evening, sitting on the porch as dusk settled, she realized she no longer glanced toward the driveway, no longer imagined a car pulling in, no longer rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Instead, she watched the fireflies spark in the yard and felt a sense of belonging to the present moment. She was not waiting anymore. She was living. It was not triumph that defined the turning point, but peace. A quiet peace that came from knowing she had survived, rebuilt, and discovered herself beyond the ruins of his leaving. For the first time in many years, she looked forward without hesitation. Her life was not something paused, waiting for someone else to return. It was hers, unfolding, carrying her forward into a future she was finally ready to claim. The decision came on an ordinary afternoon when she was leafing through a magazine during her lunch break. A photo of a sunlit street in Lisbon caught her eye. Narrow alleys lined with tiled walls, clotheslines strung between windows, the kind of place she had once dreamed of exploring when she was younger. For years, travel had been something deferred, postponed for the sake of work schedules, financial caution, or his insistence that there would be time later. But later had never come. She stared at the image for a long moment, and for the first time in her life, the thought of going alone didn't scare her. It thrilled her. Booking the ticket felt like an act of rebellion and reclamation all at once. She hesitated as she typed in her payment details, her hand trembling as though she were breaking a rule. Yet when the confirmation email arrived, she felt a rush of adrenaline stronger than anything she had known in years. She didn't tell many people about her plans. It wasn't secrecy so much as a need to keep this moment sacred, untouched by the doubts or questions of others. This journey wasn't for show. It was for her. The morning of her departure, she carried her suitcase out to the cab with a nervous smile tugging at her lips. The airport, usually a place of routine frustration, felt charged with possibility. She watched couples bicker over luggage and families wrangle children through security, and for once, she didn't envy them. Her solitude felt like strength. Boarding the plane, she pressed her forehead against the window, watching the ground fall away as the engines roared. For the first time in more than a decade, she was heading somewhere without anyone else's permission, anyone else's agenda. Lisbon greeted her with bright light and the scent of the ocean. The streets were alive with sound, tram bells clanging, vendors calling, footsteps echoing on cobblestone. At first, the unfamiliarity overwhelmed her. She stumbled over maps, struggled to order food in halting Portuguese, felt conspicuously alone among groups of travelers. But then something shifted. Sitting at a cafe one afternoon, sipping strong coffee while guitars played nearby, she realized no one was watching her. No one cared that she was alone. And with that realization came freedom. She didn't need to fill silences with conversation, didn't need to negotiate what to do next. Every decision belonged to her. She wandered through markets, ran her fingers along the edges of hand-woven scarves, tasted pastries dusted with sugar, and let herself get lost in winding streets without panic. She climbed hills that left her breathless and stood at viewpoints overlooking red rooftops that stretched toward the sea. She lingered in museums without checking a watch, allowed herself to sit on park benches for hours, simply watching life unfold. The city became her companion, and she reveled in the intimacy of exploring it at her own pace. There were moments of loneliness, of course, dinners where she wished for conversation, evenings where couples passed her holding hands and she felt a pang of absence. But the loneliness no longer crushed her. It was manageable, softened by the realization that she was capable of carrying it and still enjoying the world around her. She was discovering that solitude could be expansive, that it could hold beauty as well as ache. On her last night, she stood on a hill overlooking the city, the lights shimmering against the dark water, and felt tears sting her eyes. Not from grief, but from gratitude. Gratitude that she had dared to step into the unknown, that she had proven to herself she could move through the world untethered. She whispered softly into the night, as though speaking to the woman she had been years ago. "You did it." When she returned home, nothing in the house had changed. The furniture was the same, the walls still painted with the colors she had chosen. Yet everything felt different. She walked inside with a new ease in her body, a sense of expansion that travel had carved into her. The journey had not just been about Lisbon. It had been about her own capacity to live, to choose, to embrace freedom without apology. And she knew, standing in her doorway, that it was only the first of many journeys yet to come. When she returned from her journey, there was a restlessness in her bones, a hum of energy that wouldn't let her slip back into the old rhythms. The trip had shown her that she could move through unfamiliar streets and not only survive but thrive. And now that freedom demanded expression in her daily life. She began to notice the small corners of her days that had once been filled with his preferences, the hobbies she had quietly placed aside because they didn't fit his idea of what mattered. One by one, she reached for them again, as if reclaiming lost parts of herself. It started with painting. In the back of her closet, behind boxes she hadn't opened in years, she found the old set of brushes and tubes of acrylic she had bought in her 20s. She remembered how he used to dismiss it as a phase, teasing her gently but often enough that she eventually put the supplies away. Pulling them out now, she spread a sheet across the table and dipped a brush into color, her hand unsteady at first, her strokes awkward. But soon, the colors began to blend, shapes emerging on canvas in ways that made her breath catch. Hours slipped by unnoticed as she painted into the night, the act itself more important than the outcome. It wasn't about being good. It was about being free. From there, she turned to the piano in her parents' house, the one she had played as a child. They had kept it polished even after she left, its keys still holding the faint echo of her early lessons. She sat down tentatively at first, her fingers stumbling over notes she once knew by heart. Yet as she practiced, the melodies returned, flowing through her hands with a tenderness that soothed her. Music filled her evenings, the house no longer silent, but alive with chords and rhythms that reminded her she still had a voice, even if it came through keys instead of words. Books, too, returned to her life. For years she had set them aside, claiming she had no time, though in truth it was because he had often mocked the genre she loved. Now she devoured them. Novels that carried her to distant lands, biographies that reminded her of resilience in others, poetry that spoke truths she could not yet articulate herself. Pages piled on her nightstand, her evenings consumed not by longing but by discovery. She began cooking not just for sustenance but for joy. The kitchen, once a place where she catered to his palate, became her laboratory again. She experimented with spices, tried recipes from her travels, baked bread that filled the house with warmth. She hosted small dinners with friends, serving dishes that reflected her spirit, meals shared with laughter that spilled into the night. Each bite, each conversation, was a reminder that she was no longer shrinking herself to fit another's mold. Even the outdoors drew her in. On weekends, she hiked trails just outside the city, her boots crunching against earth, her lungs filled with air that tasted sharper and clearer than the stale weight of her old life. She learned the names of wildflowers, carried notebooks to sketch the shapes of trees, allowed herself to pause and listen to the wind as though it were speaking to her directly. Nature became another canvas, another companion. What surprised her most was not how much joy these passions brought, but how much of herself she had abandoned before. Looking back, she saw how often she had stifled her interest for the sake of peace, how many pieces of herself she had trimmed away to fit inside a life that had never been large enough for her. Now those parts blossomed, filling the spaces where emptiness once ruled. One evening, standing before a finished painting, a glass of wine in her hand, she smiled to herself. The canvas was messy, imperfect, streaked with colors that didn't blend smoothly, but it was alive. Like her, for the first time in years, she felt not just like she was surviving, but flourishing. By the time she reached her early 40s, the turbulence of her 30s had settled into something steadier, a rhythm of life that no longer felt dictated by absence or survival. The years had not been easy, but they had shaped her into someone she barely recognized when she looked back. Her reflection in the mirror carried lines that had not been there before, but they told a story she had grown proud of. They were not marks of defeat. They were reminders of endurance. The changes had not come all at once. They were built slowly, layer by layer, like bricks carefully placed after a collapse. Each choice she made in those years, painting her home, advancing at work, traveling alone, rediscovering passions, became part of a foundation stronger than anything she had built before. Where once she had been tentative, moving through her days as though waiting for life to resume, now she moved with purpose. Her steps no longer faltered when she entered a room alone. Her voice no longer wavered in meetings or conversations. The woman who had once cried herself to sleep night after night had transformed into someone who understood that silence could be filled with peace instead of fear. Her home reflected her transformation. The walls she had painted years earlier still carried their bold colors, now softened with the patina of time. Bookshelves overflowed with novels and poetry. Canvases leaned against corners waiting to be hung. And her piano was no longer just a reminder of childhood, but a companion she played each evening. Friends who visited often commented on the atmosphere, how warm and alive the house felt. She would smile, knowing that it was not just the furniture or the colors. It was her presence, finally whole, that gave the space its glow. Her career continued to flourish, but what mattered most to her was not the titles or promotions, though they came steadily. What mattered was the respect she had earned. Younger colleagues still sought her guidance, not just on tasks, but on how to navigate setbacks, how to find resilience when things crumbled. She never pretended to have all the answers, but her honesty, her willingness to admit how hard the journey had been, carried more weight than any lecture could. She had become a quiet anchor for others, a presence people trusted, not because she was flawless, but because she was real. Her family, too, had become a steady source of comfort rather than a mirror of her pain. Conversations that once circled around what she had lost now centered on who she had become. At gatherings, she no longer felt like the odd one out. She was the aunt who took nieces on hiking trips, the sister who hosted dinners filled with laughter, the daughter her parents leaned on in their aging years. She no longer defined herself by the role of abandoned wife, but by the role she chose to embrace. Creator, traveler, mentor, friend. There were still nights when loneliness touched her, but it no longer consumed her. She had learned to sit with it, to let it pass like a wave without pulling her under. She understood that strength did not mean erasing sorrow, but carrying it without letting it dictate her every breath. Her life had become a testament to this balance, a blend of scars and growth, of loss and renewal. On her 42nd birthday, surrounded by friends and family, she realized she had not thought of him in months. The man who had once defined her pain had faded into the background of her story. His leaving was still a chapter, but no longer the whole book. She had written new pages, filled with color, music, and quiet joy. And as she blew out the candles on the cake, she did not wish for his return or for answers long withheld. She wished only for more of what she had already built. Years of quiet strength, steady and enduring, carrying her into whatever came next. It was late in the afternoon when she heard the knock. The sound startled her, not because it was loud, but because it carried a rhythm she hadn't heard in years. 2 quick raps, a pause, then another. For a moment, she froze in place, the book in her hand slipping closed as though her body understood before her mind did. When she opened the door, the sight before her seemed both familiar and unrecognizable. He stood there, older than the man who had walked away 13 years earlier, his hair thinner, his face lined, his shoulders no longer carrying the same easy confidence. He looked smaller somehow, as if the years had worn him down, carved him into someone less certain of himself. For a long moment, neither spoke. She studied him with a stillness that felt foreign even to herself. Once, the sight of him would have unraveled her, would have sent memories rushing back like a flood breaking a dam. Now she simply observed, her heart steady, her breath even. He broke the silence first, his voice softer than she remembered. I didn't know where else to go. The words hung in the air between them, fragile, heavy. She let them linger, refusing to rush in and rescue him from the weight of his own admission. His eyes darted past her into the house, as though searching for a trace of the life he had abandoned. But what he saw was not the home he once knew. The walls bore colors he had never chosen. The shelves were lined with books he had never read. And the space radiated a warmth that had nothing to do with him. She stepped aside, allowing him in, though every movement felt deliberate, controlled. He entered slowly, as though unsure he had the right, his gaze flicking across the room with a mix of nostalgia and disorientation. He sat at the edge of a chair she motioned to, his hands clasped together, fingers restless. For once, he did not look like a man in command of his choices. He looked like someone who had been stripped of certainty, arriving at her door with nothing but the remnants of pride. "You've done well," he said finally, gesturing vaguely to the house, the subtle markers of a life rebuilt. She nodded but did not answer. He shifted uncomfortably, then tried again. "I thought I had more time. I thought—" His voice faltered, the sentence unfinished, swallowed by silence. She waited, patient, unmoved by his attempt to gather sympathy. At last he confessed, his words tumbling with the weight of failure. The ventures he had chased after leaving her had collapsed. The relationships he had pursued had soured. The people he thought would stand by him had drifted away. He spoke of regret, of loneliness, of mistakes he could not undo. His eyes, once sharp with certainty, now pleaded with her, searching for understanding, for mercy. She listened without interruption, her face unreadable. Inside, she felt a strange sensation of distance, as though his story belonged to someone else, a life she had once brushed against but no longer inhabited. His desperation did not move her to pity, nor did it rekindle the ache of abandonment. Instead, she felt the solidity of herself, the years of quiet strength that had carried her to this moment. When he finally fell silent, his eyes brimming with expectation, she met his gaze steadily. The man who had once left her with nothing but silence now sat before her, seeking an answer, and for the first time, she understood that she owed him nothing, not explanation, not forgiveness, not the comfort of easing his regret. He leaned forward in the chair, his hands trembling slightly as though he could not keep them still. The confidence he once carried so easily had drained from him, replaced by something rawer, something almost childlike in its desperation. She sat across from him, her posture calm, her gaze steady, waiting. For a moment, he struggled to form the words, his mouth opening and closing as if the sentences resisted him. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and uneven. "I made a mistake," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Walking out that door, leaving you behind, it was the worst decision of my life." He paused, searching her face for a flicker of softness, but she gave him none. He pushed on. "At the time, I thought I needed something different, something more. I thought I was chasing freedom or maybe happiness, but all I found was emptiness." His hands tightened together, the knuckles pale. "I ruined everything that mattered." The words spilled out faster now, as though once begun they could not be stopped. He told her the women who came and went, relationships that never lasted, connections that always soured. He spoke of jobs lost, ventures failed, friends who drifted away when success no longer clung to him. Each confession was coated in regret, yet also tinged with the hope that sharing them might stir her compassion. "I kept thinking about you," he admitted, his voice cracking. "About the way you looked at me, about the way you believed in me even when I didn't deserve it. No one else ever did that. No one else ever loved me the way you did." She remained silent, her eyes steady on him. Inside, she felt a curious stillness, a clarity that surprised her. The words he spoke would have once shattered her, years ago when her heart was raw and her nights were filled with tears. But now, they struck her differently. They sounded less like love and more like loss, not hers, but his. He leaned closer, urgency sharpening his tone. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging for another chance. Let me try again. Let me make it right." His voice caught in his throat, and he drew in a shaky breath before continuing. "We had something good once. We could have it again. I've changed. I see it all now, everything I threw away." The room felt heavy with his pleading, the air thick with the weight of what he wanted. He reached for her hand across the table, but she pulled back slightly, not abruptly, just enough to remind him that the distance between them was no longer one she was willing to close. He froze, his arm hanging in the air for a moment before he let it drop, shame flickering across his face. "I need you," he whispered, almost too softly to hear. "I don't know how to go on without you." His eyes glistened. The desperation laid bare. The man who once walked away now reduced to begging for the place he had abandoned. She studied him, her heart steady. His plea was loud, filled with regret. But it was not the kind of love she had rebuilt her life around. It was need, it was emptiness. It was a hunger for what he had lost. And for the first time, she recognized the power in her silence. She no longer had to chase answers, no longer had to wonder why he left. The truth sat in front of her, asking for what she had already learned to live without. The weight of his words settled between them, but she did not bend beneath it. Years ago, his plea would have shattered her defenses, would have had her searching for the remnants of love she once carried, desperate to stitch something broken back together. But time had done its work. She had endured the silence, the whispers, the long nights of doubt. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, without him. And now, sitting across from the man who once left her hollow, she felt no need to rescue him from the ruins he had made. He leaned forward, his voice cracked with urgency, repeating his apologies, tried to reach for her hand again, as though touch might soften the truth. But she drew back ever so slightly, her stillness saying more than words could. For the first time, it was he who fumbled, he who shifted uncomfortably in the chair, his confidence stripped away. He looked older than she remembered, not just in the lines on his face, but in the weariness of his spirit. She recognized it for what it was, not wisdom, not humility, but defeat. She sat upright, her shoulders squared, and in that posture alone lay the answer to years of struggle. She no longer carried the fragility of abandonment. She was no longer the woman who waited by the window, hoping for the sound of his car, who searched every silence for a reason he might return. She was a woman who had painted her walls bold colors, who had traveled across oceans, who had earned respect in boardrooms, who had taught herself how to sleep again. She was not incomplete without him. She had become whole in his absence. The shift in power was almost tangible, a current in the room that both of them felt. He had once been the one with choices, the one who left with calm detachment, believing she would remain tethered to him no matter the years. Now it was his turn to sit in uncertainty, to wait for words that might grant him reprieve. She saw the pleading in his eyes, the quiet panic that underpinned every sentence he spoke. He needed her forgiveness, her acceptance, her willingness to give him another chance. But she needed nothing from him. Her silence unsettled him. He shifted, cleared his throat, tried again. "I know I hurt you, more than I can ever undo. But I've realized what matters now. You, us." His words hung limp, failing to bridge the distance. She let him speak, let him fill the room with the sound of his regret, but inside she felt only clarity. It wasn't anger that steadied her, nor was it bitterness. It was a knowledge that her life no longer hinged on him. She thought of the years she had spent believing his absence defined her. Yet here he was, returned, diminished, looking to her as though she were the anchor he had lost. The irony struck her with quiet force. He had once left her to prove something to himself, to chase a life he thought would be better. Now, it was she who embodied stability, strength, survival. She did not need his return to validate her worth. His desperation was proof enough of how far she had come. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, measured. "You're not the man I waited for," she said softly, "and I'm not the woman you left." The words didn't rise with anger. They fell with certainty, solid and undeniable. He blinked, startled, as though only now realizing that his plea had met a wall stronger than his longing. In that moment, the balance of their story tilted. The power he once held had dissolved, and she no longer feared the silence he left behind. He was the one adrift now, clinging to a past that she had already outgrown. She watched him sit there, smaller than she had ever seen him, and understood the truth she had spent years searching for. She was free, and he was the one bound by regret. The silence stretched between them until she finally broke it. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp, and for the first time since his return, it was she who controlled the direction of the conversation. "Tell me," she said, leaning back in her chair, "what did you do with all those years?" The question hung in the air like a blade, not cruel, but cutting nonetheless. He shifted, his gaze flicking down to his hands, the movement betraying the discomfort he could not mask. She pressed further, her tone still even. 13 years. That's a long time to disappear from someone's life. You walked out of this house, left me standing in the doorway, and never looked back. What filled your days? What was so much more important than the vows you made? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. His lips parted, then closed again, his throat working as though the words caught before they could form. Finally, he muttered something vague. "I was searching for something I thought I needed," but the explanation fell flat, more hollow than silence. She tilted her head slightly, watching him, waiting for more. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the floor, the bookshelf, anywhere but her face. "And did you find it?" she asked. The question was sharper this time, less forgiving. His hesitation was answer enough, but he stumbled through an admission. "No, not the way I thought I would. There were distractions, people who didn't last, jobs that didn't last. I kept thinking the next thing would be different." He trailed off, his voice growing quieter as he spoke, shrinking beneath the weight of his own confessions. She studied him closely. His face, once so controlled, betrayed every word he didn't say. The twitch in his jaw when he mentioned other women, the sag in his shoulders when he spoke of work, the way his eyes clouded when he tried to frame failure as a lesson. She had lived with him long enough to recognize when he was hiding behind vagueness, and she knew now that the details he withheld mattered more than the ones he spoke aloud. "What about me?" she asked finally. "Did you ever think about what those years did to me? Did you imagine me sitting in this house alone, wondering why I wasn't enough for you to stay?" The question landed heavy, and though he tried to meet her eyes, his gaze faltered, slipping away. His silence told her everything his words could not. She leaned forward now, her tone firmer. "You talk about mistakes, about regrets. But what exactly do you regret? The women you left when they didn't give you what you wanted? The jobs you couldn't hold? Or do you regret what you did to me?" His face tightened, his mouth pulling into a strained line. He opened his mouth to answer, but what came out was stumbling, uncertain. I regret leaving you. I regret all of it." But the lack of conviction in his tone betrayed him. His eyes dropped again, and she could see the truth in the lines of his face, in the weariness he carried. He regretted what he lost, not what he had done. He regretted the comfort, the stability, the unwavering love she had once given him, but not the choice that had torn her life apart. That distinction mattered, and she saw it clearly. She sat back in her chair, letting his stammered words die in the air. For years, she had begged the silence for answers. Now, with him sitting across from her, she understood that the answers had never existed. He could not give her what she had longed for, because there was nothing of substance behind his decision. His departure had not been about her failures, but about his emptiness. His face, lined with regret but devoid of real clarity, revealed more than his words ever could. And in that moment, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The years of wondering, of circling questions that gnawed at her, ended not with a revelation but with the realization that he had no answers to give. She had spent so long believing that closure lay in his explanation, but the truth was that closure lay in a recognition of his hollowness. He had nothing she needed, nothing she had not already given herself. He shifted uneasily in the chair, as if the weight of her gaze pressed him into discomfort he could no longer hide. For years, he had carried himself with an air of certainty, the kind of man who believed he always had options, always had a way forward. Now, stripped of pride and sitting in the very house he once abandoned, his composure cracked. His words spilled out reluctantly, fragments of stories he had once guarded as though secrecy could shield him from shame. After he left, he said, there had been a woman almost immediately. She was younger, quick to laugh, unburdened by the years of shared history he had fled. For a time, he convinced himself she was what he had been searching for, a fresh start, a chance to rewrite the parts of himself he didn't want to face. But it didn't last. Within a year, the spark had dulled and the cracks began to show. She wanted stability, the very thing he had thrown away, and when he couldn't give it, she left. He spoke of her with a hollow voice, not because he still loved her, but because she was the first reminder that walking away had not freed him from himself. Then came the ventures, business ideas he chased with desperation, each one beginning with confidence and ending in collapse. He invested in a restaurant with a friend, certain it would succeed, but within 2 years it was gone, debts piling higher than profits. After that came a series of smaller pursuits, consulting jobs, short contracts, promises of success that dissolved before they could become real. Each failure left him more adrift, more unsure of who he was without the stability he had once despised. There were more women too, though he spoke of them in vague terms. A few months here, a year there, relationships built on temporary affection, none with the weight or endurance he had once had in the life he abandoned. Each one ended in disappointment, either because he grew restless or because they saw through him. By the time he reached his 40s, he admitted the pattern had become clear. He was chasing not love, not purpose, but distraction, temporary escapes from the gnawing emptiness that followed him everywhere. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, offering no rescue as he unraveled his story. In the shifting of his eyes, in the tremor of his voice, she could see the truth. He had not simply made mistakes. He had lived in failure, each choice compounding the last, until the man who once walked away with such certainty was reduced to fragments of regret. The most striking part was not the failures themselves, but the absence of growth. He had left in search of something, yet all he had found were broken ventures and fleeting faces. He had not learned, had not transformed, had not faced himself until the losses piled so high he could no longer ignore them. His years apart had not been a journey of discovery, but a descent into disappointment. She studied him as he spoke, realizing that the man before her was not simply older, but diminished. His shoulders slumped in ways they never had. His voice carried none of the conviction that once defined him. He had spent 13 years searching for meaning outside the life they built, and all he had found was proof that the meaning had been there all along. Proof he only recognized when it was gone. When his words trailed into silence, he looked at her with a pleading expression, as though laying bare his failures might stir sympathy. But she felt none. What she saw was a man undone by his own choices, someone who had abandoned stability in the hope of finding more, only to discover less. And for the first time, she felt no urge to measure herself against his leaving, no need to wonder why she hadn't been enough. His failures had never been about her. They had been about him, and the hollow places he could never fill. The room grew still after his words trailed into nothing. He sat across from her, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, his story scattered in half-finished sentences and confessions that sounded more like excuses than truths. For years, she had been the one bound by silence. She had carried it like a burden, lying awake through endless nights, begging answers from empty air, filling notebooks with questions that never received replies. That silence had crushed her, left her hollow, taught her how to live with absence. But now, for the first time, the silence did not belong to her. It belonged to him. She let it stretch between them, heavy and deliberate, She did not rush to respond, did not offer the comfort of words to ease his shame. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady, her body calm. He shifted under it, fidgeting with his hands, glancing up only to find her eyes unwavering before dropping his gaze again. The man who once walked away with quiet certainty now squirmed in the stillness, every second of her restraint pressing down on him harder than accusations ever could. He tried once or twice to fill it, starting to speak, and then faltering when he realized there was nothing left to say that would matter. His throat worked, his lips parted, but no words came. She remained unmoved, her silence exacting a toll greater than any outburst of anger could have. For years she had imagined what she would say if he returned, how she might scream, demand explanations, cry out for justice. But now she found she needed none of it. Silence had been her prison once. Now it was her weapon. As he shifted in discomfort, she thought back to the countless nights she had begged for closure. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table alone, staring at the empty chair where he once sat, whispering questions to a ghost. She remembered the humiliation of family gatherings, the way she endured the whispers of neighbors and the pitying glances of relatives. She remembered the years when her own voice had seemed too small, when she convinced herself that silence was survival. All of it came back to her now, not as pain, but as strength. Those years had forged her into someone who no longer needed his answers. The longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became that he was unraveling in it. His shoulders slumped lower, his breathing grew uneven, and when he finally looked up at her, his eyes were wet, his face etched with the shame of a man who realized he had lost far more than he could ever recover. He opened his mouth again, as though to plead once more, but the weight of her silence stopped him. It told him everything her words did not need to, that she was no longer a fragile woman he had left, that she had built a life without him, that she did not need to explain herself now or ever. For the first time in their history, he was the one drowning in unanswered questions. He was the one searching her face for scraps of mercy, the one waiting in vain for words that would ease his regret. And she, steady and silent, understood the full shift of power. This was no longer his story to control. The silence was hers now, and it was enough. The silence lingered until she decided to break it, not because he deserved her words, but because she had carried them inside for too long. Her voice was steady when it finally came, quiet yet firm, every syllable sharpened by years of reflection. "You need me to say something," she began, her eyes fixed on him. "But this isn't about what you need anymore. It's about what I've learned." He looked up quickly, hope flickering across his face, but she did not soften. She continued, her words flowing not with anger but with clarity. "When you left, I thought it was the end of me. I thought I wasn't enough, that something was missing in me that made you choose to walk away. I spent years punishing myself with questions, searching for answers that never came. But those years taught me something I didn't know back then. They taught me that my worth was never tied to whether you stayed or left. My value didn't disappear because you decided to close the door. I didn't vanish just because you turned your back." She saw his throat tighten, the way his eyes shifted, but she pressed on. "I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I learned to live alone. I learned to walk into rooms without a partner beside me. I learned to travel, to paint, to laugh again without asking anyone's permission. I learned that my silence wasn't weakness. It was survival, and now it's strength." Her tone softened slightly, though it carried no pity. "You talk about regret. You talk about mistakes. But regret doesn't rebuild what was destroyed. It doesn't undo years of absence. It doesn't erase nights I spent wondering why I wasn't enough. You want another chance, but I don't need to give you one, because I've already given myself the life I once thought you took away from me." He tried to speak then, his lips parting as though he could interrupt, but she raised her hand slightly and he stopped. "Listen," she said, calm but unyielding. "I don't hate you. I don't wish you harm. But you can't walk back into my life and expect it to be waiting for you. I've filled the spaces you left. I've discovered who I am without you. And that woman has no reason to step back into the shadow of your absence. I am not broken anymore. I am whole." His face crumpled, the weight of her words pressing harder than any anger could. He leaned forward as if reaching for her, But she did not move. "I'm not the woman you left," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in calm. "And I will not become her again." The room grew quiet once more, but this silence was different. It was no longer filled with unanswered questions or grief. It was filled with certainty, with the finality of her decision. She had spoken her truth, not to wound him but to free herself. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and for the first time she saw him not as the man who had walked away, but as a man who had lost himself long before he left. She stood slowly, her movements measured, and though she did not say the words aloud, her actions made them clear. Her future no longer included him. He sat frozen, his eyes searching her face as though somewhere in its stillness he might find a crack, some hidden softness that would let him believe there was hope. But her expression was calm, resolved, not angry, not pleading, simply certain. He had come expecting tears, perhaps anger, maybe even the faintest trace of longing that could be rekindled. Instead, what he found was a woman who no longer trembled in his presence, who no longer carried the wound of his leaving as an open scar. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, and spoke the words that would unravel whatever he had thought possible. "You don't get to have me back," she said, steady and clear. There was no cruelty in her voice, only truth. "You made your choice years ago, and I live with the consequences. I rebuilt my life from the ground up, and I will not tear it down just because you suddenly regret what you did. I am not waiting for you. I never was. Not anymore." The words struck him harder than if she had shouted. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He had prepared for anger, for accusations he could counter with apologies. He had rehearsed promises to change, speeches about how different he was now. None of it mattered in the face of her certainty. He had no argument for a woman who no longer needed him. She continued, her tone firm but not harsh. "You left me thinking I would collapse without you. You thought I'd be waiting, that my life would stand still until you came back. But I'm not the fragile woman you abandoned. I've learned to stand without you. And the truth is, I don't want you beside me anymore. Not as a husband, not as a partner, not in any way that gives you the power to break me again." He blinked, stunned, the muscles in his face tightening as though he were bracing against the blow. She could see the weight of her words sinking into him, stripping away whatever remnants of pride or hope he had brought to her door. His shoulders slumped further, his hands slack in his lap. For the first time, the silence was not hers to bear. It was as heavy and suffocating, filled with the realization that he could not undo what he had done. Her voice softened then, not with pity but with finality. "You'll carry your regrets. That's yours to live with, but I will not carry them for you. My life is no longer tied to your choices. My peace isn't something you can give or take away." She let the words settle in the air, each one a barrier that he could not cross. He lowered his head, his lips parting as though to beg once more, but the fight had gone out of him. Her certainty left no room for bargaining. There was nothing left for him to hold on to, no thread of hope to pull. What she had given him was not forgiveness, not a second chance, but the truth he had never expected, that he was no longer needed, no longer wanted, no longer part of her story. When she finally stood, the quiet authority of her movements was more powerful than any outburst could have been. She looked at him one last time, her eyes calm, and in that gaze he saw what he had never believed possible, that she was free, and he was the one left bound by the past. He had returned thinking he could reclaim what he had lost. Instead, he discovered that she had already moved beyond him, her life larger than the space he once occupied. The door closed behind him with a soft click, not the slam she once feared, not the echo that had haunted her for years, but a quiet, final sound that seemed to seal the past in its place. She stood still for a moment, her hand resting loosely at her side, her breath steady. There was no rush of tears, no collapse of strength. Instead, there was a calm she had never known when his absence was forced upon her. This time it was different. This time, he had left with her permission, or rather, with her refusal to let him stay. And that choice, her choice, was the difference between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The house around her seemed to exhale with her, every wall and window alive with the life she had reclaimed. For so long it had been filled with memories of his laughter, his footsteps, his silence. Now, as the evening light spilled across the floor, she realized the space carried only her presence, her warmth, her survival. She walked slowly through the rooms, not to chase ghosts but to claim them fully. The couch she had chosen, the walls she had painted, the shelves lined with books and small trinkets from her travels, all of it testified to a life she had shaped with her own hands. Nothing about it depended on him anymore. That night, she sat at her piano, her fingers tracing the keys before pressing into a melody she had been practicing for weeks. The notes rose into the air, not fragile, not hesitant, but full and steady. She played for herself, for the years she had survived, for the mornings she had woken with doubt, for the nights she had spent sleepless. She played because she could, because the sound was hers to create. And as the music filled the house, it felt like a declaration. The silence he had left behind no longer owned her. She had filled it. The next morning, she woke early, sunlight streaming through the curtains she had chosen. She brewed her coffee, poured it into the chipped mug she loved, and stood at the window. The world outside was the same as it had been the day before. Trees bending in the breeze, neighbors walking dogs, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing. But to her it felt new. The air seemed fresher, the light brighter, the possibilities wider. She no longer measured time by the years since he left or the day he returned. Time was hers again, moving forward without a shadow trailing behind it. She thought of the younger woman she had been, the one who had begged for answers, who had waited by the window, who had believed her worth depended on someone else's choice to stay. That woman had endured what she thought she could not, and she had walked her through to this moment. She felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the resilience it had revealed. She was no longer waiting, no longer wondering, no longer defined by his absence. As she stepped outside, the morning air wrapped around her, cool and clean. She locked the door behind her, the key firm in her hand, and walked down the path with her head high. She didn't know exactly where the road ahead would take her, whether it would lead to new love, new adventures, or simply more quiet mornings filled with music and books. But she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever came next, it would be hers. The story of her life no longer carried his weight. It carried her strength. It carried her freedom. And as the sun climbed higher, she walked forward into the day, unburdened, unafraid, ready for a future that belonged entirely to her.